This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Lee Hawkins. Hawkins is the author of I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, out from HarperCollins, January 2025. A critically acclaimed memoir that traces 400 years of his Black American family's history through enslavement, Jim Crow apartheid, and the intergenerational trauma that followed. His book is an introspective journey into his family's history, tracing its roots to pre-revolutionary America. Utilizing genetic testing, investigative reporting, and historical documentation, Hawkins explores 400 years of his family's lineage, revealing the intertwined lives of Black and white families, their resilience and sufferings, and the impact of historical trauma. The book received a star review from Kirkus, calling it harrowing and insightful, a profound work about the Black experience in white oppression. I Am Nobody's Slave received another starred review from Library Journal with a verdict that this work is vitally important and essential to understanding the magnitude of the impact of racism and violence. This personal exploration serves as a broader commentary on the importance of genealogical research in healing and bridging racial divides in contemporary America. Hawkins is the series creator, producer, writer of the 2024 long-form podcast series, What Happened in Alabama, for American Public Media, Minnesota Public Radio. The series was named a Best Podcast by The Guardian and Amazon Audible and was editor's choice among Amazon Audible's history genre podcasts. It was ranked 25 on Apple Podcasts' Top Shows chart, which is based on a combination of listener engagement, follows, and episode completion rates. The book was named a Black History Month pick by Oprah Daily and Oprah's Book Club, selected as Amazon Editor's Pick and Best History Book, and praised by Essence as a great read for those seeking healing. Booklist described it as gripping, thought-provoking, and personal, and the Christian Science Monitor called it a liberation movement worth reading about and practicing. Endorsements include Deborah Watts, cousin of Emmett Till and co-founder of the Emmett Till Legacy Foundation, who called the book transformative. Arthur McFarland II, great-grandson of W.E.B. Du Bois, said it inspired him to reclaim his own family history. Dr. Terrence Robert of the Little Rock Nine praised Hawkins for his courage in telling the unflinching truth. His narrative provides insights into why we have been reluctant to embrace the truth of who we are. A Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2022, Hawkins is a nationally recognized investigative journalist whose most recent work documents the lives of Black American descendants of slavery and Jim Crow survivors, exposing America's role in imposing a long legacy of racial violence, childhood trauma, and economic injustice. A former longtime reporter for the Wall Street Journal, where he served for 19 years as a reporter, on-camera host, and editor, Hawkins has investigated topics ranging from systemic inequality and educational disparities to the intergenerational effects of land theft, racial covenants, and historically motivated homicides. His co-authored feature, The Dreams of Jack and Daisy Scott, was part of the Wall Street Journal's Pulitzer Prize finalist package on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Hawkins is currently a 2023-2024 Rosalind Carter Fellow for Mental Health Journalism and the 2024 Josephine Albright Fellow of the Alicia Patterson Foundation. He also received the 2024 McGraw Fellowship for Business Journalism and was the 2022-2023 O'Brien Fellow for Public Service Journalism at Marquette University. In 2023, he received his 5th Salute to Excellence Award from the National Association of Black Journalists for his investigation into how the Jesuits of Maryland used wealth from slavery to fund Georgetown University and other Catholic institutions. He was also a 2021 finalist for the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism. A versatile journalist, Hawkins has reported across print, audio, and video, and conducted high-profile interviews with influential newsmakers. He uses DNA analysis, genealogical research, and oral history to investigate America's buried truths, and his work blends historical inquiry with cultural and emotional clarity. Raised in Maplewood, Minnesota, and the historic Rondo community of St. Paul, Hawkins has long been a committed advocate for nonviolent social change, inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He organized annual MLK birthday marches and received the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award from Minnesota's King Holiday Commission. He holds a BA in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he served as editorial page editor of the Badger Herald and twice served as on the board of visitors of UW School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Through fearless storytelling and deep historical research, Lee Hawkins offers a powerful and original voice committed to truth, healing, and national and global reckoning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Lee Hawkins, journalist and author of I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, from HarperCollins in 2025. How are you doing today, Lee?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Thank you so much for being here. I did get an opportunity to read your book, so we can definitely talk about that. But I wanted to start with what drew you as a journalist and author to work on Black life.
I think that from the time I was a young child, I had heavy influence from my great-great-grandmother or my great-grandmother's mother, Roberta Davis, who encouraged me to journal and was very critical in helping me understand that there were Black writers before me who grew up in the same area that I did in Minnesota, Gordon Parks, August Wilson, and also Carl T. Rowan, who was a prominent journalist who actually was one of the tenants of my great-grandparents when he was studying for his master's degree at the University of Minnesota, because Black students were not allowed to stay in the dorms there. And so I always had an understanding that being a writer was, as a Black boy growing up, was going to be one of the options that I could pursue. And I was very influenced by the work of a lot of people. Tony Brown was a big influence on me. Carl T. Rowan was an influence. William Raspberry. And I read a lot of newspapers, and I did read a lot of books. Alex Haley, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I just think that I knew from a very young age that I wanted to write about my experience, and the Black American experience in the context of growing up in Minnesota, but also growing up in the Black community and in the suburbs, and that duality was just something that struck me. I think that I was constantly standing up for Black people in both spaces, in the white suburban community against hate speech, and in the Black community about what I write about in the book, the real nigga expectation versus the Black excellence male. And I was constantly going between those two and struggling like a lot of us do. And so I think I wrote about that in my journal, and my great-grandmother encouraged me to do that. And so, there was never a time in my mind that I thought I couldn't do that. And I think it's just beautiful that when Black people in our village support our kids, because it's the people in the village who encourage me to write. And of course, because I live a Black life, I'd want to write about a Black life. And I spent a lot of time, 19 years at the Wall Street Journal, kind of denying myself to be able to fully do that. So I'm feeling very free right now, and really stepping into my own, in the fact that I'm able to now turn my investigative reporting skills to our community so that I can give back and pay some rent on the planet.
So, speaking of that, right? So, you have your 19-year career at the Wall Street Journal, and then you had the podcast before you had the book, right? You
Yes.
want to speak a little bit about how going from being a journalist with a well-known and established publication to doing the podcast, then
Yes.
transitioned into the book process?
Yes, most definitely. So I got the book deal in 2018, and the book took me about 10 years to write. So for the last 10 years, at the Wall Street Journal, which I left in 2022, I was already working on I Am Nobody's Slave. And also at the Wall Street Journal, I did a lot of broadcasting as well. And so when I left, not long thereafter, I started a fellowship at Marquette University as an O'Brien Fellow for Public Service Journalism, where me and my students worked with APM, American Public Media, on the What Happened in Alabama podcast. And I did that podcast because I wanted it to be a prelude to I Am Nobody's Slave. The question, What Happened in Alabama, is all about my father who lived through Jim Crow, but never spoke about Jim Crow in any detail when I was growing up. And we were in Minnesota, and I felt a longing to want to learn more about Alabama and to want to know my family members in the South. And I think that one thing that gets lost is that there are a lot of Black people who have that experience. You know, slavery wasn't the only thing that split our families up. Jim Crow split our families up. You know, a lot of people will praise the Great Migration and say how great it was. Um, and it was great for many of us. But at the same time, my father left due to trauma because his mother had died. And as the fact that he didn't want to look back really split us up in the family. And so I think that doing that podcast was my way to start to answer that question and to provide some framework for Black people who also feel similar, that we didn't know what Jim Crow was, that we were taught that Jim Crow was segregation. But when I did my investigation, I realized it was apartheid and it was a crime against humanity. And that's what the podcast was about. And so that's not something that I would have been able to do at the Wall Street Journal. I think the Wall Street Journal is the best financial newspaper in the world. But I wanted to delve deeper into, once again, Black life. And it's something that I prepared for over a decade. And it feels great. It feels so great to be able to be unapologetically reporting and writing about my people.
So you mentioned the fellowship at Marquette. And I know that, particularly in writing this book, there was a lot of research and study, both genealogical research, but also broader historical research, and making the connections that you make between what happened in Alabama, and the lasting effects on Black communities to this day. So, what would you say has been the role of study in both your journalism and your writing?
Oh, that's a great question. So yes, I did a lot of study. I did several fellowships, not just the O'Brien Fellowship, but I did one at USC with the Annenberg Center for Health Journalism, and that was all about childhood well-being and childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and the way that that can shorten life expectancy with a disproportionate emphasis on Black and Brown children. And I also was a Rosalind Carter Fellow for Mental Health Journalism at the Carter Center in Atlanta from 2023 to 2024. And that gave me access to the experts I needed in the mental health community to not just write about the experience, but to really bring some academic heft to the reporting that I was bringing forth in my intergenerational report in I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. I also read a lot of books, and I couldn't put a number on how many books I read before, but also in the process of writing I Am Nobody's Slave. But I'll tell you that to write a book of this caliber, I think you need to read, dozens of books. And some of the ones that touched me um, the most were the book about the legacy of Jim Crow by Dr. Ruth Thompson Miller. The Half Was Never Told by Edward Baptist. Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGray, and also lots of studies on things like the perception of Black people's ability to withstand pain, higher levels of pain, corporal punishment, and the legacy of that, and as it relates to colonial times, and the fact that corporal punishment is still legal in 17 states, and primarily the states where slavery was legal, and all kinds of archives and genealogical research, to be able to go back and trace my family history all the way back to the 1600s, and to even look at lines that were not mentioned in the book, was something that I needed to do. I probably did, more research than people would think, but to come up with, I pretty much reported out two books, so I'll probably hopefully be able to use the information that I reported for the second book. But my point is that, and why I love this question is, I think a lot of times, when we write about these issues, we write from the hip and not enough being rooted in the study, and to be able to, in a devastating way, in an undeniable, unrelenting way, prove the points that we're making about the more than justified reality that reparations, and or at least some way of addressing the legacy of slavery and then the legacy of apartheid, should be, a real discussion that we should have. And I think too many times people feel that they're experts on these subjects, but really haven't done a lick of research and come in and just write from the hip, as I say it. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do the best job that I could, and I feel like I succeeded.
Thank you. So I think that it's important that we talk a little bit about the book, specifically, since we've been referencing it since we started. So the book really does look at the impact of Jim Crow apartheid, and slavery on some of the practices that continue to persist in the Black community. Like you said, corporal punishment, um, as well as physical punishment of children. Um, one of the things that struck me about the book was the level of vulnerability that you integrated into it, which I think was very effective in terms of sharing that story. But the interweaving of your own personal story with your family's history, and the broader history within the context within which your family and so many other Black families are operating, I think really does help to drive the point home. So, would you like to speak a little bit about your initial goals for the book, as well as um, what you hope can come from your the finished product?
Thank you. Yes. As I said, I was always concerned and for my father, because when I was a kid, my father was a strong, tall, hardworking Black man who was my best friend and was omnipresent in my life, um, in so many ways, and loved me deeply. That said, I also saw that he had nightmares sometimes, and in the morning I would ask him what he was dreaming about, and he would just say, "Alabama, son," but he wouldn't really go into detail, as I said before. And in my home, and in my church community as well, there wasn't a lot of room for error, for any of us. And, a lot of the discipline that we received, as you referenced, was the belt. And that was something that was, pretty prevalent for most of the people that I knew. And I was very curious about where all of this came from, in particular when I saw the movie Roots, when I was a kid, and I saw that brutal scene involving Kunta Kinte. And I always had a hunch that it was related to slavery. But once again, I didn't know, even though there were so many people who would say that it was related to slavery. And so I wanted to trace it all the way back, and find out for myself how slavery and Jim Crow affected my generation, and if any of that had anything to do with with the hypervigilance and the hyper cautiousness and the fear that my father had for me, almost like he was still living in Alabama, when we were living in Minnesota. And what I realized, and this is what I feel like my work says about Black life and what I wanted people to know, was that, um, once again, Jim Crow wasn't what I thought segregation, and that the worst of it was Black people drinking from separate water fountains or Black people having to sit at the back of the bus. And Jim Crow wasn't about the protests. I mean, that's what we focus so much on is the civil rights movement and the way that we responded to the injustice and not enough to the day-to-day injustice. And so in my book, I wanted to actually detail what my family members actually lived through in Jim Crow. And I realized that Black people have not recognized that we lived through a system of apartheid that affected, first of all, slavery was 12 generations, and Jim Crow affected another 5 generations of people and only ended 60 years ago, which means that we have about 8 to 9 million people alive today who were survivors of Jim Crow that have never been acknowledged as having going through a system of apartheid and having never been acknowledged as people who lived through a crime against humanity. And the reason I define it a crime against humanity is in my own family, um, there a person has been murdered every generation since 1837, including my grandfather and both of my grandparents' fathers when they were 5 and 9 years old. And in those cases, the two white men who admitted to killing them were not brought to justice in any way. And that is a common story. If you go to the Legacy Sites Museum in Alabama, you'll see that as well. It was a crime against humanity that was never recognized as such. And the survivors were reluctant to speak about it. And many are still reluctant to speak about it because of the fact that we are still living on the site of terror where a lot of the things happened. Um, and what this has done is it started to, for many generations, almost cause a PTSD effect, but I won't call it PTSD because that implies that it's over. Whenever you have something that hasn't been addressed in a family lineage, have you're always going to have, effect on that. I mean, people think that Black people are not affected because we have been so successful, and people have thought us to be both superhuman and subhuman. And the truth is, we're just human. And even though we made it look easy, we've been through a lot. And so, what I wanted to do was to address that. And finally, I'll say that my book is one of the rare books that looks at a Black boy and his father. Um, a lot of the books that we see right now with Black men, which are very important books, are books where maybe there was a single mother, or maybe the Black man is an LGBTQ community man. In my case, I'm a heterosexual Black man, which I think is very critical to this because there were elements of the way that I was raised by my father that where my father had to teach me about hypersexualization and a lot of the different things that Black boys have to deal with in modern times in order to survive and thrive in this community. And so what I did was I demystified this complicated dynamic between the Black man and his son. We see similar dynamics in August Wilson's work with Troy Maxson and his son, and we also see it in the pop culture. We saw it with Michael Jackson and his father. We saw it with Prince and his father. We saw it with my cousin Roy Jones Jr. and his father, Floyd Mayweather and his father. And this is a very big part of the Black American story. And I would say, just to close up this question, is that it's commonly thought that Black men are underachievers. But this story shows a Black boy who was pushed to achieve both by his family and his community, and that many of us are raised in the same way that our families were raised through the generations, to be highly productive, and the pressure to be highly productive and the pressure to redeem the sacrifices of the previous generation is one that all of us often feel. And it's one that can be both beautiful but also tragically brutal because of our parents' fear for us and the fact that they know that based on previous American history, the chance of us being treated fairly is not great, and that we have to do everything we can to be successful. And so, I wanted this book to really take people into a part of the experience that the literary community has not allowed us to show. This is a very more traditional experience of a Black boy raised heavily by not just his father, but his grandfather and his great grandfather, and who I knew all of them. And I was blessed to also have a strong village and a church community. And I don't see that right now in the literary community.
Thank you. I definitely think that the role that not just your father and grandfather and great grandfather, but your community played in your story um, was a key aspect of the book. It spoke to being raised in surrounded by Black study, having that be emphasized, right? Like you need to learn the speeches and you need to get the grades, and you're going to learn how to project your voice and stand up in front of people and lead marches, even when there might have been a little concern around that level of visibility. Um, the fact that you still did have that support, I think, really speaks to um, the tradition of the discipline of Black study and the importance of that community, that collective knowledge passing um, that happens in Black study spaces themselves. So building on that, how do you see your writing in relation to the history and future of Black expressive practices in the US or across the diaspora?
Well, I won't say I see it, but I hope that it inspires other people to tell stories and to use their platforms of expression to lean into these narratives that we're often not seeing, and to do the research to dig into their family history. I have developed a method that I call the future method, family unity through understanding roots and experiences. And interchangeably, I call it genealogical resolution. And what that is going back into the family history to make sense of modern realities. I'll tell you, one of the big things in my book that I talk about is the periods of difficulty that I had in my relationship with my parents, because I was trying to break cycles that I felt that they were unable to break.
Mm.
And I think that not just in protest of them, but also in a deep love for them and the kind of bloodline that they want us to have in future generations, whether they were able to do it themselves as a gift to our ancestors and also as a gift to the new generations coming along. And I think that telling those hard, nuanced stories is very important. And I just hope that people will use that expression to bring in the unique stories from their corner of the world. Um, to do that. And I hope that what I've done with my book is to give people a blueprint as to how to do that, and to do the stories that have touched us in too tender of a place to even discuss. And I hope that we use a Black expression to go deeper into what freedom looks like and what liberation really looks like, not always focusing disproportionately on the external threat to our freedom, but also what is the internal threat to our freedom. What ways do we hold each other back? What ways do we hold each other back in the mind? And what I love is to see Black Black people and especially Black young people expressing their views on the world and the many dimensions because we are such a beautifully diverse group of people. We have so much and we have so few platforms that really are giving us space to do that. And so instead of asking for it, I think it's time for us to take it and to use like, for instance, what you're doing, your podcast platform, and all of these different multimedia venues to be able to tell the stories and to take claim of our stories and really just write so much about how the past relates to the present and the freedoms that every generation is getting more of than our previous generations.
Thank you. That actually made me think of a related but like side comment or question. Um, so you have engaged in a variety of expressive practices. So as a journalist, you had a podcast, you've done, of course, speeches and interviews, and then now a long form book. What I'm curious as to what you feel are the differences between what can be communicated in those different through those different mediums or genres, or maybe it's about audience. But I am curious, as someone who is a trained and career journalist, how transitioning to a much longer form of writing in the book, what that process is like in terms of what can be communicated.
I think one of the great criticisms against me in my journalism career has always been that I've pushed for longer writing and that I've always wanted to do the long form stories and put a premium on that. My things traditionally had come in too long. And I think that the reason is because I would always do an abundance of reporting and I wanted to take time to do
Mhm,
really meaningful work, whether that be writing about, a Black Columbia PhD student who was killed tragically, months before he was to get his PhD, or whether that be our Wall Street Journal series on the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, which, was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2022. I think that the long form transition to writing a book was a powerful one because the writing for the Wall Street Journal and the few opportunities that I did take to be able to write long form kind of helped me prepare me for that. And also what prepared me was that I did a lot of interviews on camera and I did a lot of TV appearances. I didn't do much podcasting at the Wall Street Journal, but I had that in my back pocket the whole time, knowing that the podcast space was going to explode and was exploding before my eyes. And I was really sort of impatient to want to get there because
mhm,
I just think that as a medium, that is a very, 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 very powerful platform, especially for us as a people. I narrated my own book, and I feel like I was happy with the narration. I put in a lot of effort to do that. And I think that that is a medium that we should all lean into because it allows us to show not only, the emotion, but the accents and
mhm,
all of the different things that represent Black life that come across differently on the page, on the written page. I feel that where what's happening now is we see uh, a lot of people's neurotransmitters starting to evolve or change or evolve into kind of like an ADHD culture where um, we start to take in information through the audio and also maybe read bits and pieces of books and everything but also wanting our information to come across on various platforms. I tell my story in the book, I tell my story in the audio book, I tell my story on the podcast, I tell my story in interviews like this. My story is all over YouTube because I'm speaking to public audiences right now because I'm on book tour. And each one of those, in their own special way, relates to the collective message and the mission that I'm trying to get across. And so, long form is a way to do that, whether it be an hour speech or whether it be, 16-hour audio book or a over 300, 400-page book that I've written. And I don't see myself leaving that. I think that I'm going to be the kind of person that continues to do long form work. I just did another podcast series with American Public Media called Unlocking the Gates: How the North Led Housing Discrimination in America. And that came out in March. I have another interview series that I'm working on right now. And I'm going to take my precious time because I think that we can't really do a good job of telling our stories unless we get into the depth and the complexity and the nuances. And I think for people who are earlier in their careers, I think it's great to do the short journalism just to get ready. But I think we should always work towards trying to add the depth that we need in telling the Black stories.
Thank you. The depth piece, I think that again is super important. And it does speak to having that nuance and being able to integrate the importance of history and context, even in things that we're talking about contemporarily. And right now, having that historical context um, is arguably more important than ever, with so much historical reality being rewritten and erased from places. So, thank you for that. Um, so, a couple more questions. I know we both have uh, things to do, but what do you think that Black expressive practices, so writers or journalists, have done well historically, and what do you think um, maybe has not been done particularly well?
Yeah, I think that I'm very encouraged by a lot of the work that I'm seeing now beyond just mine, right? You mentioned it earlier that you've been talking to people who have written about their genealogies. I'm very a big fan of Professor Martha S. Jones, who I've appeared on some panels with. And I think that she's done a good job. Nicole Hannah Jones, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, there are just so many people who, Brian Broom. There's so many different people who have done well. I think that what we have done a great job with in general is talking about the pain inflicted on Black bodies. That term is maybe just very common and to the point now that there isn't a lot to add about that, and also about the white racism that's been projected upon us. I think that we've done a incredible job telling those stories. I think where we could be stronger is stories that look at the way that Blacks have internalized racism and turned it against each other, as I do in my book. I look heavily at the fact that, yes, white racism is a problem, but I also want to look at the ways that we allow ourselves to internalize white racism and white supremacy. And of course, we would because we are American. It was a Black person who was the first who was killed in the revolutionary movement for this country. And so, of course, we are omni American and we are going to represent colonialism. And we have to figure out how to get that out of our minds and give ourselves permission to be free. I think that there is a real kind of respectability politics and real disconnect between Blacks in academic and journalistic spaces and Blacks on all levels of society. There's too much concern a lot of times in thinking about what white racist people might think about the things that we write about our community, whether that be the homicide crisis or whether that be the internalization of colonial practices of corporal punishment and explaining, as I do in my book. how prevalent it is in the Black community. Um, and I think the only way that we can continue to tell our stories in an authentic way is to lean into the aspects of it that break new ground and a lot of research, instead of recycling a lot of the same old narratives and arguments. And the way to do that is to think in a very conscious way about the aspects of our stories that are not being told. Yes, I grew up in the suburbs, and yes, I spent a lot of time with a very strong Black village, but I write passionately, if not self righteously, about the fact that I had four friends murdered in high school. And that, yes, it's not just Black pain, but it's also Black resilience and Black empowerment. But I want to focus on Black trauma. I want that. I want that out there because I see the movement that is, being made to try to erase our history. The movie American Fiction was a very good example. I really enjoyed that movie, but it was almost a satire about people who write about Black trauma. And my thing about that is, be careful what you wish for, because if you don't want these narratives to be told, guess what? Mitch McConnell doesn't want them to be told either. And right now, there is a very active campaign to stop us from writing about the trauma that our ancestors and our elders endured, and that what we endured. And just like our Jewish brothers and sisters, we want to be able to process our Holocaust. We want to be able to process Jim Crow and what it has happened. And the first step that we can do that we can take is to actually define Jim Crow. And I don't think that we have done a good job of doing that. And so what I'm trying to do is to do even improve myself and find ways where I can be stronger. And so I'm encouraged by all of the different young and old writers from across our very diverse community that hails from three different continents. But I just want people, and I want to push myself as well, to tell true narratives that connect back to the authentic Black experiences, and not to be so concerned about what white people think, and also be cognizant of the way that our evolution into the ivory tower and into these mainstream media institutions sometimes can disconnect us from the reality of our people. And it's time to go back and reconnect, and to also not scoff at writers and academic researchers who have that connection and think it's important to keep it and preserve it.
Thank you. Um, I definitely think the point about making sure that there are connections between those who are in the ivory tower and in uh or have a mainstream media platform, and those who do not in the Black community, the everyday Black people who are living their lives but have these experiences that also should be captured and told and can be learned from, is super important. And it's definitely something that I have really enjoyed lately, and being able to talk to several people who have not only integrated their family's history, but talked about um, Black communities over time and the nuances in them, uh, not just focusing on one thing or the other, but showing the full spectrum of Black life, which I think is so important. So you kind of addressed this, but I just want to see if you want to add anything. So is there a particular issue or question that you think Black writers or people who focus on Black life in their writing should be asking right now?
Yes, I think that um, we've been through hell, in the past, all these generations, and you see the memes of Black people holding their coffee cups, saying, you know what, we did our part and we've done our, there you go, take a drink, sister. Um, we done our part in this struggle of for social justice and freedom, and we've carried every group of marginalized people on our backs, often without getting the credit for leading the movement that led to this passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which opened up the door for all of these groups that have hitched their wagons to our movement to get the rights that they rightfully should enjoy. But somewhere in there, I feel that our interests have been lost. And I think it's important for us not to focus exclusively and disproportionately on President Trump and what the GOP is doing, and to start to also look at where we've been failed by the left and where we've been failed by white liberals and also Black leaders who have been gatekeepers inside of the white liberal establishment and have told us to stand down on the very critical issues that affect our community. Some of them being things like clean water in Flint, which
Mhm.
could have been an executive order, right? At the onset of the Biden administration. Things like serious conversations about reparations. Um, and we've seen it happen in parts of California. We've seen it happen in Evanston. Why haven't we seen serious conversations happening, especially in majority Black cities, where Black people right now have the vote and have the leadership to be able to implement forms of reparations in their own communities? And so I think that it is very critical for us to focus on the low hanging fruit. Why haven't we seen writers and journalists, asking about reparations? Why haven't we seen our leaders, our journalists, holding our Black leaders accountable, holding the Democrats accountable? Why haven't we focused on the left? Why haven't the Democrats asked Black people what they want and what instead of telling us what we should want? And I think that it's our job as journalists and writers and academics to do that, because I'll tell you, I'm asked a lot on these book tours. There's always somebody who will stand up, and it's usually a well-meaning, white liberal person who will say, "Well, what should we do with about Donald Trump?" And my whole thing on that, because I'm not really a political person, I'm more of a independent thinker, and I have issues with both parties. And my thinking on that is, well, first of all, why are you coming to me? Because if you look at the vote for Donald Trump, it was vastly white Americans who voted for him, and he's doing exactly what they asked him to do and what he wanted. And so these are people in the very families of the people who are asking me this question. So why then come to me and ask me when it should be your people at your Thanksgiving dinner? It should be your parents. It should be your grandparents, and the people who are supporting, a lot of the repeal of our history and all of these different things, and having the same courageous conversations that Fannie Lou Hamer had with white supremacists. Well, she didn't want to have those conversations. We never had the privilege of being able to be so morally righteous that we would say, well, you know what, I don't agree with you. I'm not talking to you. And I think that what we're seeing right now is a crisis within the white liberal community establishment, and them not being able to step up, and a lot of people throwing in the towel so early on diversity and inclusion and everything. You would think that, that people didn't even really fight for it, and so um, a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of virtue signaling that I see. And so, as you can see, I'm very passionate about exposing this, and I am unapologetic and not afraid to focus on that and to make people understand that not just to be critical, but that this is now an opportunity. Because if people are as committed as they say they are to progressive causes, then that means there's a lot of low hanging fruit. There are things that were not done that should have been done, and as a result of them not doing it, there were a lot of Black voters who were apathetic. There were Hispanic voters who were apathetic. There were a lot of people who stayed home. And I guess the final thing that I'll say about this is one thing that we have learned from Mr. Trump is that government can be disruptive and things can be accomplished fast. He came in with over 100 executive orders. Okay. And so the truth is, the Democrats could have done the same thing. And the Democrats could do the same thing in the future. They could come in for 100 with 100 executive orders for clean water in Flint, for the rebuilding of our communities, for the homicide crisis, for a lot of things that Black communities need support on, and especially for finally acknowledging Jim Crow as apartheid and a crime against humanity. That's something that the Democrats could have done right away, and they haven't done it. And so I'm interested not just in talking about what Mr. Trump hasn't done, but also talking about and raising the questions about what our brothers and sisters on the left could do to help empower ourselves, empower us, and also empower the nation. Because when you empower Black people, you empower America, because Black people built America and we are America in many ways. And a lot of the trends and everything that we see in this country and the political movement and activism flows from Black people. And that's why so many people are in distress right now, because Black people are holding the coffee cup.
Well, thank you so, so much.
All
Um,
right.
is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, the book is called I Am Nobody's Slave: How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. And I would also like to thank you for the work that you're doing, and for giving Black writers and academics a platform for doing this. It was a wonderful opportunity in the conversation that we had before. And I also want to thank you for working with the students in the way that you do, because that's going to be the key for all of us, is the kids. And I'm so proud of them. I saw what they did in the George Floyd protest, and they were kids of all backgrounds and all races. And you're right there on on the level with them. And I love the fact that you're spending that time to mentor them. And that's exactly what I'm talking about people in our worlds, in the journalistic space, in the academic space, always keeping a connection
Mhm.
to our community. So thank you so much. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so, so much for your time, for having this conversation, and for the conversation that you have in your book. I do think it's an important one, and one that I hope that the way that it is presented and laid out in the book facilitates much more conversation about these
Good.
issues. So thank you
And if
so, so
people
much.
bring me to speak, I hope people bring me to speak. I'm speaking all over the country right now, and I have a lot to say, as you can see, and a lot to write. So thank you. Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
opportunity.